In the 3rd century BC, in the bustling Egyptian port city of Alexandria, Ptolemy II Philadelphus stood before the greatest collection of knowledge the world had ever seen. Scrolls lined endless corridors. Works from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond filled countless rooms. The writings of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides. Medical texts by Hippocrates. Mathematical treatises by Euclid. Astronomical observations. Poetry. History. Philosophy. Science. Everything humanity had learned, everything we had written, all gathered in one place. The Library of Alexandria held somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 papyrus scrolls. Nobody knows the exact number. But what we do know is this. It was the largest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean to study there. Discoveries were made within its walls that wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. And then, gradually, over centuries, it all disappeared. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is considered one of history's greatest tragedies. We can never know what knowledge was lost. What scientific advances. What literary masterpieces. What historical records. All gone. And the question that has haunted historians for nearly 2,000 years is simple but impossible to answer completely. What happened? Who destroyed it? And what did we lose? This is the story of the Library of Alexandria. How it was built. What it contained. And the mystery of how humanity's greatest repository of knowledge vanished from the earth. The story begins with Alexander the Great. In 332 BC, Alexander conquered Egypt during his campaign to defeat the Persian Empire. On the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, at the western edge of the Nile Delta, Alexander founded a new city. He named it after himself, Alexandria. Then Alexander moved on, continuing his conquests, and died young at age 32 in Babylon in 323 BC without ever returning to see the city he'd founded. After Alexander's death, his massive empire was divided among his generals. Egypt went to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and most trusted commanders. Ptolemy became pharaoh of Egypt, founding what historians call the Ptolemaic dynasty. Though he was Macedonian Greek by birth, Ptolemy took on the titles and trappings of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But he also brought Greek culture and learning to Egypt. It's unclear whether Ptolemy I himself conceived the idea of the Great Library, or whether it was his advisor Demetrius of Phaleron who proposed it. Demetrius had been a student of Aristotle and had ruled Athens for a time before being exiled. He brought with him a deep respect for learning and knowledge. Whoever first had the idea, the result was revolutionary. The Library of Alexandria was part of a larger institution called the Mouseion, the museum, meaning the shrine of the Muses. The Muses were Greek goddesses who inspired learning and the arts. The Mouseion was a research institute, a place where scholars could live and work, supported by royal funding. They received free food and lodging. They paid no taxes. Their only job was to study, write, and expand human knowledge. And at the heart of this institution was the library, a collection that would hold all the knowledge of the world. That was the explicit goal. Not just Greek knowledge. All knowledge. From every civilization. In every language. The first universal library in human history. Construction likely began under Ptolemy I but was completed under his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who reigned from 283 to 246 BC. And once it opened, the Ptolemies became obsessed with filling it. They didn't just buy books. They acquired them through any means necessary. There are incredible stories about how the library obtained texts. One method was to search every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor. Officials would board vessels and demand to see any books or scrolls on board. If they found anything interesting, they'd confiscate it, take it to the library, and have scribes make a copy. Sometimes they'd return the original to the owner with compensation. More often, they'd keep the original and return the copy. These texts were labeled as from the ships. Another famous story involves Ptolemy III and his quest to obtain the original works of the great Greek playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These precious manuscripts were kept in the state archives in Athens and were never lent out. But Ptolemy desperately wanted them for Alexandria. So he offered Athens an enormous deposit, equivalent to several tons of silver, just to borrow the manuscripts long enough to copy them. Athens, convinced no one would forfeit such wealth, agreed. Ptolemy had the manuscripts brought to Alexandria. He had his scribes make beautiful copies on fresh papyrus. Then he sent the copies back to Athens and kept the originals, forfeiting his massive deposit. Athens was furious. But the Library of Alexandria had the original texts of the greatest works of Greek drama. The library's collection was staggering. Ancient sources claim anywhere from 40,000 to 700,000 scrolls. Modern historians are skeptical of the highest numbers. A building large enough to store 700,000 scrolls would have been enormous, and there's no archaeological evidence of such a structure. The most conservative and probably most accurate estimates suggest the library held 40,000 to 50,000 scrolls at its peak. But remember, ancient works often required multiple scrolls. Homer's Iliad alone would take up multiple scrolls. So 50,000 scrolls might represent perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 individual works. That's still an incredible collection, larger than anything that would exist again until the late Middle Ages. And the diversity of the collection was unprecedented. The majority of texts were in Greek. The works of Homer, the earliest and most revered Greek poet. The philosophical writings of Plato and Aristotle. The medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen. The mathematical works of Euclid and Archimedes. The histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. The plays of the great dramatists. Poetry, science, medicine, astronomy, geography. But the library also held works from other cultures. Egyptian texts, including religious writings and historical records. Babylonian astronomical observations that went back centuries. Persian Zoroastrian texts. Hebrew scriptures. Indian philosophical and mathematical works. The library employed translators to render foreign texts into Greek so they could be studied by Greek-speaking scholars. One of the library's most famous projects was the translation of the Hebrew Torah into Greek. This translation, known as the Septuagint, was completed in the 3rd century BC and became the basis for much of later Christian Old Testament scripture. The library also had the world's first library catalog. A scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene created the Pinox, meaning tablets. This was a massive catalog dividing all the library's holdings into categories: rhetoric, law, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, mathematics, natural science, and miscellaneous. Within each category, works were organized alphabetically by author. It was a monumental undertaking that made the library's vast collection actually usable. The scholars who worked at the Mouse Ion were the intellectual elite of the ancient world. Euclid, the mathematician who wrote Elements, the most influential mathematical textbook in history, worked there. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, was head librarian. Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun 17 centuries before Copernicus, studied there. Hero of Alexandria invented an early steam engine. Galen advanced medical knowledge. Hypatia, one of the few female scholars of the ancient world, taught mathematics and philosophy there centuries later. The discoveries made at Alexandria were extraordinary. Herophilus and Erasistratus performed the first systematic dissections of human bodies, laying the foundations of anatomy. They discovered the function of the nervous system. They distinguished arteries from veins. They understood that the brain, not the heart, was the center of intelligence. Aristarchus calculated the relative distances to the sun and moon. Eratosthenes didn't just measure the Earth's circumference. He also created a remarkably accurate map of the known world and calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis. These weren't just guesses. These were scientific observations and calculations that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance over 1,000 years later. The library grew so large that by the 1st century BC, a daughter library was established at the Temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, in another part of Alexandria. This branch library reportedly held over 40,000 scrolls, all of which were copies of texts from the main library. So what happened? How did this incredible institution, this repository of human knowledge, disappear? The answer is complicated, controversial, and ultimately unsatisfying. Because the truth is, we don't really know. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is one of history's greatest mysteries. The first disaster came in 48 BC during Julius Caesar's occupation of Alexandria. Caesar had pursued his rival Pompey to Egypt and became entangled in the Egyptian civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar sided with Cleopatra. Egyptian forces attacked. Caesar found himself trapped in the royal quarter of Alexandria with the Egyptian fleet in the harbor ready to attack. In a desperate tactical move, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships. The fire spread. It jumped from ship to ship, then to the docks, then into the city itself. Parts of the royal quarter burned, including areas near where the library was located. Ancient sources disagree on what happened to the library in this fire. Plutarch, writing over a century later, claimed the entire library burned. Cassius Dio reported that warehouses near the docks containing scrolls were destroyed, but didn't mention the main library. Other sources don't mention the library at all. Most modern historians believe the main library survived this fire, though some scrolls stored in warehouses may have been lost. We know this because later sources, including the geographer Strabo who visited Alexandria around 20 BC, mention using the library's collections. The library clearly still existed and functioned after Caesar's fire. But Caesar's fire was just the beginning of the library's troubles. In the centuries that followed, the library began a slow decline. The Ptolemaic dynasty was fading. Egypt came increasingly under Roman control. In 30 BC, after the deaths of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Egypt became a Roman province. The Mouse Ion continued to exist, but Roman support was inconsistent. Funding decreased. Scholars left. The collection was no longer actively maintained or expanded. By the 3rd century AD, the library was a shadow of what it had been. Between 270 and 275 AD, Alexandria was invaded by forces from Palmyra, a city-state in modern Syria. Emperor Aurelian led the Roman counterattack to retake the city. The fighting was intense. Large portions of Alexandria were damaged or destroyed, including much of the royal quarter where the Mouse Ion and main library had been located. Most historians believe that if any significant remnant of the original library still existed at this point, it was destroyed during this conflict. The daughter library at the Serapeum may have survived, but the main library was likely gone by 275 AD. The Serapeum continued to function for another century. But by the late 4th century, Alexandria was changing. Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were being closed or destroyed. And in 391 AD, Theophilus, the Christian patriarch of Alexandria, received imperial permission to demolish pagan temples in the city. The Temple of Serapis was a major pagan religious site. Theophilus led a mob that ransacked and destroyed it. Contemporary accounts describe violent clashes between pagan worshippers who tried to defend the temple and Christian crowds determined to tear it down. The temple was destroyed. What happened to any books that might have still been stored there is unclear. Some were probably destroyed. Others may have been scattered or looted. There's one more story about the library's destruction that we need to address, even though most historians now believe it's false. In the 7th century AD, Arab forces under General Amr ibn al-As conquered Egypt. Several centuries later, stories began circulating that Caliph Omar had ordered the library's remaining books burned. According to these accounts, Omar declared that books either agreed with the Quran, making them unnecessary, or disagreed with it, making them heretical. Either way, they should be destroyed. The story claims the scrolls were used as fuel to heat Alexandria's public bathhouses for 6 months. This story was first recorded in the 13th century, over 600 years after the supposed event. No contemporary sources mention it. And by 640 AD, the library almost certainly no longer existed in any meaningful form. Most modern scholars believe this story was invented during the Crusades as propaganda. Christians wanted to portray Muslims as enemies of learning. Muslims later used the story to justify book burnings by medieval Islamic rulers. But the story itself is almost certainly false. So what really happened to the Library of Alexandria? The boring but probably accurate answer is that it died slowly over centuries. The fire in 48 BC may have damaged it. The invasion of 270 to 275 AD likely destroyed what remained of the main library. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD eliminated the daughter library. But the real killer was neglect. Declining funding. Loss of political support. The shift from pagan to Christian culture. The library didn't die in one dramatic conflagration. It faded away, starved of resources, its collections scattered or destroyed piecemeal over hundreds of years. And what did we lose? That's the question that haunts anyone who learns about the Library of Alexandria. What knowledge disappeared forever? We'll never know the full extent. But we can make educated guesses based on references in surviving texts. We lost the majority of ancient Greek literature. Of the estimated 700 plays written by the three great Greek tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, only 32 survive. We lost hundreds of works. The library had copies of all of them. Gone. We lost most of ancient Greek comedy. Aristophanes wrote over 40 plays. We have 11. The library had them all. Lost. We lost the works of hundreds of ancient historians, philosophers, scientists, and poets whose names we know only from references in other texts. Entire categories of ancient knowledge vanished. Alternative theories of the universe. Different schools of philosophy. Medical texts. Mathematical proofs. Engineering knowledge. Some scholars speculate that the ancient world was on the verge of scientific and technological breakthroughs that wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. Hero of Alexandria invented a primitive steam engine. If the library's engineering knowledge had survived, could the Industrial Revolution have happened centuries earlier? We'll never know. The loss isn't just about specific texts. It's about continuity of knowledge. When the library was destroyed and its contents lost, humanity lost access to accumulated wisdom. Future generations had to rediscover things that ancient scholars already knew. We had to reinvent ideas, recalculate measurements, relearn lessons. The destruction of the library created gaps in human knowledge that took centuries to fill. There's a modern epilogue to this story. In 2002, the Egyptian government, with support from UNESCO and other international organizations, opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a new Library of Alexandria, built near the site of the ancient library. It's a stunning modern structure designed to hold 8 million books. It has research facilities, museums, and archives. The new library can't replace what was lost. But it represents something important. The same human impulse that drove the Ptolemies to gather all knowledge in one place. The belief that learning should be preserved and shared. That knowledge belongs to all humanity. That libraries are more than buildings full of books. They're monuments to human curiosity and our endless desire to understand the world. The ancient Library of Alexandria is gone. Its scrolls are dust. Its scholars are dead 2,000 years. The knowledge it contained is lost forever. But the idea it represented survives. The dream of a universal library. A place where all human knowledge can be gathered, preserved, and shared. That dream didn't die with the ancient library. It lives on today in libraries around the world, in digital archives, in our continuing efforts to preserve and expand human knowledge. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria remains one of history's greatest tragedies. Not because of how it was destroyed, which was probably gradual and unglamorous, but because of what was lost. Knowledge we'll never recover. Texts we'll never read. Discoveries we'll never know about. The accumulated wisdom of ancient civilizations, gathered in one place and then scattered to the winds. We can never know exactly what the ancient world lost when the Library of Alexandria disappeared. But we can honor its memory by continuing the work the library began. By preserving knowledge. By supporting libraries and archives. By remembering that what one generation learns must be passed to the next, or it will be lost forever. The Library of Alexandria is gone. But its legacy, the dream of gathering and preserving all human knowledge, survives. And as long as we remember what was lost, we'll work to ensure such a catastrophic loss never happens again.